In the 1950s, America built something the world wasn't supposed to see: a nuclear-powered airplane. Not a concept, not a drawing, a real aircraft carrying a live nuclear reactor flown over U.S. soil. For decades, this project was hidden under layers of secrecy, its pilots sworn to silence, its existence denied. But recently declassified documents reveal the truth, a story of ambition, fear, and how close we came to turning the sky radioactive. This isn't science fiction. It's a forgotten chapter of history that almost changed everything. In the aftermath of World War II, the world entered a new kind of arms race, not just for weapons, but for power itself. The atomic bomb had split the atom and ended a war. Now, the question haunting military strategists was simple: what comes next? In 1946, buried deep within classified military files, U.S. scientists proposed an idea so radical it would remain locked away for decades: an airplane powered by a nuclear reactor. Not powered by fuel that would run out in hours, but by uranium that could theoretically keep it airborne for weeks, months, maybe longer. The proposal arrived on the desks of generals who had just witnessed cities vanish in atomic fire. To them, this wasn't madness, it was destiny. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. The balance of terror had begun. Both superpowers understood the new arithmetic of survival. Whoever controlled the skies controlled the future. Conventional bombers could strike deep into enemy territory, but they needed fuel, needed bases, needed vulnerabilities. The logic became inescapable. If America could build a bomber that never needed to refuel, it could circle the globe indefinitely, carrying nuclear weapons, untouchable, unstoppable. A flying fortress that could remain airborne during a nuclear exchange, ready to retaliate from the stratosphere. President Eisenhower's military advisors called it the ultimate deterrent. Others called it something else: playing God at 30,000 feet. Officially, the project didn't exist. When journalists asked about rumors of nuclear aircraft, Pentagon spokesmen offered practice denials. Congressional records were redacted. Budgets were buried in black line appropriations, labeled only as special projects. But behind closed doors, at General Electric's laboratories in Ohio and Air Force bases scattered across the Texas desert, something extraordinary was taking shape. Codenamed NEPA, later renamed the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Project, hundreds of the nation's brightest minds began work on an impossible machine. Their mission was clear: build a nuclear airplane, make it fly, make it work, and above all, make sure no one outside this room ever knows about it. The classified stamps came down like guillotines. Every blueprint, every memo, every test result, buried. Even the scientists working on different aspects of the project weren't allowed to know what their colleagues were building. They were creating something that had never existed, something that perhaps should never exist. But in the Cold War's frozen logic, the impossible was simply what you did before breakfast. The project evolved through phases, each more ambitious than the last. NEPA gave way to ANP. Budgets swelled into hundreds of millions. Engineers worked in climate-controlled bunkers, designing systems that existed only in their nightmares and their dreams. The challenge was staggering. A nuclear reactor doesn't just produce power. It produces heat, radiation, and contamination. How do you put that inside an aircraft? How do you shield the crew from lethal doses of gamma rays while keeping the plane light enough to fly? How do you prevent a crash from becoming a radiological catastrophe? Two competing designs emerged: the direct cycle, where air would flow directly through the reactor core, getting heated to extreme temperatures before rushing through jet engines. Efficient, elegant, and catastrophically radioactive. Every exhaust trail would be a stream of contaminated particles. The indirect cycle used a heat exchanger, safer, heavier, more complex. The reactor would heat a liquid metal coolant, which would then transfer heat to compressed air. Less efficient, but perhaps survivable. While engineers debated these paths, another team faced a simpler question. Could humans even survive near an active reactor in flight? There was only one way to find out. In 1955, a modified B-36 bomber rolled out of a hangar in Fort Worth, Texas. Its designation, NB-36H. Its nickname among those who knew, the Crusader. But there was nothing holy about what it carried. Inside its fuselage sat a live, operational nuclear reactor, not a mock-up, not a simulator. 3 megawatts of sustained nuclear fission, contained in a shielded compartment just behind the cockpit. To protect the crew, engineers had built a fortress within the plane. An 11-ton shield of lead and rubber surrounded the cockpit. The windows weren't glass, they were lead-impregnated crystal, nearly a foot thick, dense enough to stop radiation, but clear enough to see through. The effect was like looking through green-tinted aquarium walls. The pilots wore dosimeters that measured their radiation exposure in real time. Before each flight, they suited up like astronauts, knowing they were about to climb into one of the most dangerous machines ever built. One pilot later recalled the dark humor that kept them sane. "We used to joke that if this thing went down, they'd have to quarantine half of Texas. Then we'd laugh. Then we'd get quiet." The NB-36H weighed 350,000 pounds, fully loaded. It needed every inch of runway. When it lifted off, accompanied by a chase plane carrying emergency medical teams, the ground crews would watch until it disappeared, then check their own dosimeters, just in case. Between 1955 and 1957, the NB-36H flew 47 times. Each flight carried a live reactor operating at full power. The reactor didn't power the engines, not yet. These were proof-of-concept missions, testing whether a crew could survive proximity to an operating nuclear pile at altitude. The flights followed careful patterns over remote areas of Texas and New Mexico. Flight plans were classified. Airspace was cleared without explanation. If civilians on the ground looked up and saw the massive bomber with its unusual escort, they had no idea they were watching history's most dangerous experiment. Every takeoff was a calculated gamble. The reactor was shielded from the crew, but not from the world. If the plane had crashed, if the containment had ruptured, the fallout could have contaminated hundreds of square miles. Prevailing winds could have carried radioactive particles across cities, farms, schools. The pilots knew this. They flew anyway. Engineers on the ground monitored telemetry, tracking radiation levels, reactor temperatures, structural integrity. Each successful landing was celebrated quietly, professionally. Each flight proved the impossible was real. But proving something can be done is different from proving it should be done. Despite the heavy shielding, despite the dosimeters and the protocols, every member of the NB-36H crew understood the truth. The reactor wasn't truly contained. It was managed, monitored, mitigated. But a runaway reaction, a containment breach, a simple mechanical failure at the wrong moment, any of these could turn their aircraft into a flying Chernobyl. Declassified footage shows the crew walking toward the plane in full protective gear. Their movements are careful, deliberate. They don't rush. They don't joke for the cameras. These are men walking into a situation they've calculated but cannot fully control. One engineer who worked on the shielding later admitted, "We did the math. We knew the maximum safe exposure. We also knew that in an emergency, an engine failure, a rapid descent, a prolonged flight, those limits could be exceeded. We just didn't talk about it." The reactor operated at over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The shielding worked through absorption, laid and rubber-stopping gamma rays and neutrons. But absorption creates heat. The cockpit was simultaneously frozen from altitude and heated from radiation exposure. Temperature regulation became as critical as oxygen supply. Not everyone believed the project was worth pursuing. Within the Atomic Energy Commission, scientists raised urgent concerns. Internal memos, declassified decades later, reveal heated debates. One physicist wrote, "We are contemplating a weapon system that, upon malfunction, could render an area the size of Rhode Island uninhabitable for decades. The military advantage must be extraordinary to justify this risk." Another countered, "The Soviets are pursuing the same technology. If they achieve it first, our strategic position becomes untenable. We cannot afford moral hesitation when survival is at stake." The debate reflected a deeper Cold War paradox. Nuclear weapons were justified as instruments of peace, deterrence through mutual destruction. But a nuclear-powered bomber added a new dimension of risk. It wasn't just a delivery system for atomic weapons. It was itself a potential radiological disaster, flying over friendly territory. Environmental scientists warned about the direct cycle design. If implemented, it would essentially create a flying reactor that spewed radioactive exhaust across its entire flight path. Every training mission would contaminate the upper atmosphere. Every test flight would leave traces of cesium and strontium in the air. Military strategists dismissed these concerns as acceptable operational considerations. The engineers building the plane found themselves caught between pride in their technical achievement and horror at its implications. They were solving problems that had never been solved. They were also creating problems that had never existed. By 1960, the Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Project had consumed over $1 billion, an astronomical sum for the era. The NB-36H had proven that humans could fly with an active reactor, but that was only the first step. Actually powering the engines with nuclear energy remained elusive. The engineering challenges multiplied. The weight of shielding made the aircraft impractical. The direct cycle's radioactive exhaust was politically impossible. The indirect cycle couldn't generate enough power to justify its complexity. And then, the world changed. Intercontinental ballistic missiles emerged as a faster, cheaper strategic deterrent. Why build a bomber that never needs to refuel when you can launch a missile that reaches its target in 30 minutes? In 1961, President John F. Kennedy inherited the program. After reviewing classified briefings, he made a decision. The project was terminated. Not suspended, not delayed, terminated. The reactors were carefully dismantled. The NB-36H was scrapped, its radioactive components buried in secure facilities. Documents were classified at the highest levels. Personnel were debriefed and reminded of their security clearances. Within months, it was as if the nuclear airplane had never existed. The airfield in Texas returned to conventional operations. The hangars were repurposed. The runway that had launched the world's only nuclear aircraft now hosted routine training flights. But the ground beneath that runway would remain slightly radioactive for decades. For over 20 years, almost no one outside the program knew what had been accomplished. The NB-36H became a ghost story, whispered among aviation historians, a rumor dismissed by official sources. Documents began to be declassified in the 1980s, slowly, carefully, with entire pages still redacted. Researchers pieced together the story from budget reports, technical papers, and the reluctant testimonies of aging engineers. Some of the pilots spoke publicly before they died. They described the weight of flying something that could kill thousands if anything went wrong. They talked about the pride of being chosen for such a mission, and the relief when it was finally canceled. Today, you can find fragments of the story in aviation museums, a lead glass window from the cockpit, photographs of the NB-36H in flight, technical diagrams with the most crucial details blacked out. The reactor cores were buried in the Nevada desert, in facilities that will require monitoring for thousands of years. Long after America has forgotten the Cold War, long after the names of everyone involved have faded from memory, those waste sites will still require guardianship. That's the true half-life of ambition. The nuclear airplane was never really about flight. It was about control, about demonstrating that America could command even the atom itself, could make it serve military objectives, could bend physics to political will. It was about the seductive logic of technological supremacy, the belief that if something can be built, it should be built. That hesitation equals weakness, that the side willing to take greater risks deserves to win. We see this pattern repeat across history. Every generation has its own version of the nuclear airplane, some dream that seems inevitable, logical, even necessary, until suddenly it doesn't. Today we chase artificial intelligence that might surpass human intelligence. We edit genes with precision that would have seemed magical decades ago. We build weapon systems that make decisions in microseconds, faster than any human can intervene. Each advance is justified by the same logic that justified the NB-36H. If we don't build it, someone else will. If we hesitate, we lose. Progress demands courage, and courage means accepting risk. But the nuclear airplane should haunt us. It reminds us that not every technical achievement represents genuine progress. That capability and wisdom are not the same thing. That the fact we can do something doesn't resolve the question of whether we should. In chasing the power of forever, we almost built a machine that could never die, a bomber that could circle the Earth until the uranium fuel finally decayed, decades or centuries hence. A weapon system that would remain dangerous long after its mission ended, after its war concluded, after its nation fell. The engineers succeeded, the plane flew, the reactor worked. By every technical measure, the project was a triumph. And yet, everyone involved understood why it had to end. Perhaps the most dangerous reactor wasn't the one sealed in lead and rubber in the NB-36H's fuselage. Perhaps it was the one inside us, the human compulsion to push boundaries, to achieve the impossible, to prove our supremacy over nature and rival nations. That reactor has no shutdown mechanism. It runs on ambition, fear, and pride. It generates power that can light civilizations or burn them to ash. The nuclear airplane was classified, then canceled, then forgotten. But the impulse that created it never stopped. It's still running, still generating heat, still pushing us toward the next impossible thing. The question isn't whether we can build it. The question is whether we'll recognize the moment to stop. Before we're flying too high, carrying something too dangerous, over territory too precious to risk. The NB-36H made 47 flights and was grounded forever. How many flights do we get before we learn the same lesson?